In June 1816, people in New England froze to death while the crops rotted in the fields. Governments across Europe, North America, and Asia recorded those deaths, under fever, under starvation, under exposure, and not one of them wrote down the real cause. A mountain most of them had never heard of had exploded 14 months earlier, 7,000 miles away. And the question that no archive has ever fully answered is this: how many people died because no government was willing to say so? The number is larger than anyone was told. Welcome to the Grim Archive. Tonight's file: the year without a summer. On April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, erupted with a force that remains the largest volcanic explosion in recorded human history. The mountain released an estimated 160 cubic kilometers of bulk tephra into the atmosphere. The sound was heard more than 2,000 kilometers away. Observers in Batavia, nearly 1,300 kilometers distant, initially reported it as cannon fire. The island of Sumbawa lost most of its population within days. The immediate dead numbered approximately 71,000. The 71,000 is the number history remembers. It is the smaller number. Tambora ejected an estimated 60 megatons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. That aerosol veil spread across the Northern Hemisphere over the following months, reflecting sunlight back into space before it could reach the ground. Global average temperatures dropped by somewhere between half a degree and 1 full degree Celsius. That sounds modest. In an agricultural world operating on subsistence margins, where a single failed harvest meant families did not eat, half a degree was the difference between a crop and a catastrophe. The aerosol would persist for more than 2 years. By the spring of 1816, the pattern was already wrong. In April, unusual frosts killed newly planted crops across New England and Quebec. In May, temperatures in New York State dropped to near freezing. In June, frost was recorded as far south as Virginia. In parts of Vermont and New Hampshire, snow fell in summer. Farmers who had planted twice replanted a third time and watched the third planting die. In Europe, the situation was worse. The summer of 1816 was among the coldest in centuries of European record. How far back that ranking extends is genuinely debated among historians, depending on which climate reconstruction is used. But no serious scholar disputes that it was catastrophic. In Ireland, the summer rains were relentless and prolonged, flooding fields that never dried. In Switzerland, it snowed in August. The famine came quietly, the way famines always do. In France, grain prices rose by 50% by the end of 1816. In Switzerland, the government banned the export of grain. In Germany, food riots broke out across many cities and towns. A band of starving peasants in Alsace was fired upon by troops protecting a grain shipment. In the United States, the price of oats quadrupled. In Quebec, the harvest of 1816 was described in contemporary accounts as virtually nothing. Across Bengal, the monsoon failed, and rice prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. No government in any of these places named a common cause. Each recorded its crisis as local, as manageable, as temporary. Famine is rarely the final cause of death. What follows famine is disease. In 1816 and 1817, a severe typhus epidemic swept through Ireland, then Britain, then the European continent. Historians now estimate the epidemic killed tens of thousands who had already been weakened by hunger. In 1817, the first pandemic of Asiatic cholera, a disease that would go on to circle the globe multiple times across the 19th century, began in Bengal. Many researchers believe the climate disruption of 1816 created the precise conditions of flooding and population displacement that allowed that first cholera outbreak to ignite. That connection is genuinely debated in the scholarly literature, and the evidence is circumstantial rather than conclusive. But the pandemic that followed killed millions. Tambora's reach, direct or indirect, was longer than anyone calculated. The death toll question is the one historians have never fully resolved. The direct dead from the eruption itself, approximately 71,000. The dead from famine and disease in the following 2 years across Europe, North America, and Asia, Estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000, and some researchers argue the true figure, accounting for excess mortality that was never properly attributed, is higher still. The uncertainty is not accidental. Governments did not count these deaths as connected to a single cause because they never acknowledged a single cause. Every death register from this period lists the proximate cause: hunger, fever, cold, never the distal one. The mountain is invisible in the records. The silence was not ignorance. Some people knew. Benjamin Franklin had speculated decades earlier, in 1784, that the Laki volcanic eruption in Iceland the previous year might have caused the unusually cold European winter of 1783 to 1784. The mechanism, volcanic aerosols reducing solar radiation, was within reach of the era's scientific thinking. By 1816, several European natural philosophers were observing the anomalous sunsets, the dry fog that had hung over the continent since mid-1815, and the persistent cold. They made the connection privately, but no government convened an inquiry. No official body published a finding. The science existed. The will to apply it did not. Acknowledging the cause meant acknowledging there was nothing to be done. The political logic was cold and comprehensible. Europe in 1816 was exhausted. The Napoleonic Wars had ended only the year before. Governments were managing debt, demobilized armies, and restless populations already primed for unrest. The last thing any administration needed was to announce that the deaths of tens of thousands had been caused by a geological event on the other side of the world, one that no treaty, no army, and no tax could address. In the United States, the response was simpler still. People left. Between 1816 and 1817, a wave of migration out of New England and into the Ohio Valley and beyond was directly driven by failed harvests. They moved. They did not ask why. There is one more consequence that history tends to list as a footnote, but probably should not. The year without a summer drove the price of horse fodder, oats and hay, so high that horses became unaffordable to feed in parts of Europe and North America. Some historians argue this created direct economic pressure that accelerated interest in a horse-independent form of transportation. Carl von Drais invented the first steerable two-wheeled running machine, the precursor to the bicycle, in 1817. The connection is argued, not proven. But the disruption of 1816 reshaped economies and migrations and inventions in ways that were never traced back to the mountain, because the mountain was never officially part of the story. The formal scientific connection between the Tambora eruption and the year without a summer was not established in the literature until the 20th century. The oceanographer Henry Stommel and his wife Elizabeth published a systematic popular account in 1983, nearly 170 years after the deaths. The death toll estimates that include famine and disease mortality did not enter mainstream historical discussion until even more recently. The records were always there: the parish registers, the price indexes, the harvest reports, the migration tallies. Nobody had arranged them around the correct center of gravity. The mountain was always the answer. It took a century and a half to ask the right question. What the year without a summer leaves behind is not a mystery. The cause was always known, at least to the mountain. What it leaves behind is a question about institutions. How many deaths does a government need to not explain before the silence becomes its own kind of policy? The records from 1816 and 1817 are complete. The deaths are entered, cause by cause, in their thousands. The word Tambora does not appear in any of them. The dead were counted. They were simply not connected. That is a different kind of erasure than burning the documents. It is quieter. And in some ways, it is harder to undo. If you want the next file when it opens, subscribe. The archive is always open.